but Heather, I remembered. And Dr. Mendoza, if you want to kind of jump and get things started for us.
Yeah, so first, welcome everybody. We are having a little bit of a technical issue with volume of people being able to jump on. So those of you that are on, if you would continue to do what you're doing by potentially pivoting and having others in your hallway, at your grade level, in your department, maybe joining you in your instructional space, of course, masked, so that we can have as many people participate today as possible. I want to welcome everybody. I am thrilled to be able to be on this session for a couple of minutes. We have an amazing learning opportunity ahead with a very special guest who you will get to meet shortly, but really wanted to acknowledge and thank initially the amazing work for the last 15 months of everybody in this school district. Round Lake is 1,000 strong. We have over 1,000 employees, and all of you have played a critical role in getting us to this point. I think we'd all agree the past 16 months have been very, very difficult. But I think now more than ever before, today's topic couldn't be more appropriate. Our kids are extremely special. Those of you that have history in the district know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you that are new will find out that this is an unbelievably special place to be. And I personally consider it a privilege and honor to be able to work in a community like the greater Round Lake area. Our kids need us. And to use a sports analogy, they need us to be on our A game, and we need to bring it this year. Our kids have been gone for quite a while, and I think all of you'd agree the challenge is an additional layer and bucket has been added to your toolbox that you have to account for. You not only have to provide really good experiences for kids, socially, emotionally, intellectually, academically, and the like, but now you've got to do that while dealing with a pandemic. But I couldn't be more proud of a group of people. And if anybody can meet that challenge, it's all of you. Just a little bit of background. You may or may not remember, I visited all of your buildings last year to kind of talk about our strategic plan. We spent 4 to 5 months building the plan in 2019-20. It culminated with a finalized plan in January, I believe, of 2020. And then, as you remember, everything shut down in March. But it is a really thoughtful plan. We had about 50 people with various stakeholder groups involved. And we basically rebuilt the entire plan that included a mission, vision, core values, and beliefs. And our plan incorporates multiple themes, of which one is equity, which is one of, if not the most important theme in the plan. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Lisa Steffen, our Director of Language Acquisition and Equity. She's been leading the work. She's done an exceptional job leading the work, and she will walk you through what next steps are. So just grateful for all of you for being here today, and I look forward to seeing you physically in the buildings at some point in the month of September. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. The real quick, only thing I want to just give a little bit of kudos and credit to is in the last school year, starting in February, our district went through an equity visioning process. And we did land, and then we definitely will be sharing this out with staff with it very shortly and soon. But I did want to read for you and let you see visually where we landed as our district's equity vision to just set the stage for what Paul will be sharing with you today in regards to creating an equitable classroom. So our district's equity vision is, at Round Lake area schools, we affirm the unique value and essential dignity of every child and adult. We challenge the systemic inequities in society that dishonor this belief. We commit to transforming our educational system by living equity in all we do. So that is a great segue into introducing Paul. We did work with Paul throughout the year. Many of you that are on this webinar did participate in some of the workshops that he provided in our optional afternoons last year. But without further ado, I am going to read his bio to provide a good introduction for him, and then we'll pass things on to him. So Paul Gorski is the founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. He has been working with educators in schools committed to strengthening their equity commitments and actions for nearly 25 years. Paul is the author or co-author of several books, including Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty, Strategies for Erasing the Opportunity Gap, and case studies on diversity and social justice education that's co-authored with Seema Pothany. When he's not working with educators in schools, he enjoys hiking, hanging out with cats, and spending time with family. So without further ado, Paul, it is all yours. Take it away.
Thank
Oh,
you.
I do want to, sorry, one thing, Paul. If anyone is, it looks like all of you guys are making sure your chat is going to be set to everyone so that everyone can see your comments as we work through. And then there is a Q&A session. So if you have questions, we may not get to all of them, but I will be recording the questions in a document so that we can make sure that we address any questions that come in. Sorry, now all you, Paul.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and good morning, everybody. It feels like, over time during the pandemic and all the stuff that's been happening around that, it feels sort of, to me, more and more like I'm just feeling more a sense of connection to fellow educators everywhere as we grapple with kind of shared challenges and that sort of thing. And that's always elevated at the beginning of a school year. So I just feel so honored to be able to be with you this morning for the next hour or so. And I feel really excited for you, not so much for my time with you, but my colleagues from the Equity Literacy Institute who are going to be leading the sessions that you get to choose which one you want to attend following this session. They're so amazing and great and engaging. I'm excited that you'll get to meet them, or at least one of them. So my job in this sort of general session for everybody is really just to kind of ground us in a shared understanding of what the heck equity is. As you probably know, in one sense, equity is like a buzzword, and that's used to mean all kinds of different things in education these days, also outside of education. But equity is also a really important part of, I'm sure we would all say we want all students, to have the best opportunity to succeed and to achieve to their fullest capabilities. And equity is really just a way of guaranteeing that, nobody is being sort of denied that promise, even unintentionally in education. So that's really what we're going to be talking about, just sort of grounding ourselves in a shared understanding. And then the other sessions that you'll go to after this one, we'll focus in on more specific areas and a little bit more sort of practical stuff and some classroom stuff and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where we're going. So I'm going to do a screen share so you can see my PowerPoint. So this was my topic for today: cultivating an equitable classroom or school. And what the heck does that mean? So that's what I'll be talking about. I'm going to end. We have until 9:45. I'm going to try to end right around 9:30, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions and for Q&A. And if you want to toss questions my way or make comments, you'll have the opportunity to do that. I want to get us rolling just by sharing a few starting assumptions. So when I work with a group of educators, like you all, what are some of the assumptions that I'm bringing into the conversation with me? The first assumption that I have is that all students deserve access to equitable educational opportunity, that students' race or gender identity or sexual orientation or home language or socioeconomic status any of these identities should not determine what level of access students receive. I'm just starting with that assumption. And in fact, I'm starting with an assumption that you all share that assumption, that you all believe that, well, of course, every student deserves access to that. And if you agree that all students deserve access to that and that their racial identity or socioeconomic status should not determine what level of access they have, can you just type yes in the chat box? Just give me a yes if you agree with that. Okay, so we got a lot of yeses coming in. Maybe when there are 450 people on a session, it's not strategic to tell everyone to post something. So that's really what we're talking about. So we all agree with this assumption, right? And I would think probably if there are people here who do not agree with this assumption, you probably would be careful about who you admit that in front of. So the second starting assumption, though, is that due to bias and inequity, not all students do have equitable access. Now, usually, in my view, at the individual level, not at the institutional level maybe, but at the individual level, I think most of the bias and inequity is not intentional. In other words, I don't think there's 50% of educators in your district coming to work thinking, how can we stick it to the low income kids? I don't think that happens. But because, we're all socialized in a certain way, we're all socialized, if you were brought up in the United States, in a society where there's lots of bias and inequity, that's going to inform what happens in schools. Now, again, I don't think the issue, I'm not one of these, diversity, equity trainer people who bring the sledgehammer and call everyone racist and all of that. I don't think that's very useful. I actually think that a lot of it is things that a lot of us might do or be beholden to do by our institutions that we don't even realize is having the impact that it's having. And so that's really at the individual level. A lot of what this is about is, do I have the humility to be reflective about the impact I'm having, even if that impact is not the impact that I'm intending to have? All of us do a lot of things that have very positive impacts on students. All of us do things like that we don't realize we're doing just because it's just who we are as educators. All of us, to some extent, have done damage to certain students without realizing it, without intending it. None of us want to be doing damage, but none of us is perfect, right? So, but here's the thing, is that whether or not it's intentional, the impact is the same. So that's really what we got to work on. It's like, here's the impact I want to have. Now, how can I ensure to the greatest extent possible that that's the impact I'm actually having? It takes a lot of humility, because again, none of us want to be doing any damage. None of us want to be, hurting students. I'm assuming. Right? So that's really largely what this is about. I think it's important to acknowledge we can't control everything. I think it's unjust that the societal expectation seems to be that we as educators have the power to eliminate the impact of the bias and inequity that exists outside of our spheres of influence. Like, the expectation is that we will erase the impact of poverty, which is an unreasonable expectation. We can't control the fact that, some students' parents have to work 3 jobs just to get by. So they maybe aren't, able to attend school events. We can't control that. And so I think we have to sort of let go of that. I often talk about, well, let's talk about what do I have control over? And how can I make sure the things I have control over, I'm doing those things as equitably as possible? No. But we do have the power to decide some things. I have the power to decide I'm not going to replicate those biases and inequities within my own spheres of influence. I have the power to say, hey, you know, I don't want to carry bias into the classroom. I want to create an equitable learning environment. I have the power to work on doing that the best way I know how. You know, I have the power to decide if I get some feedback about something I'm doing that might be unintentionally, you know, creating harm for students, that I can see that as a gift instead of being defensive about it. You know, I can do that. As a professional, I should be able to do that, you know. But so the question is, here are the things I have control over, here are things I have influence over. Let me just focus on that. I don't have to take on all of structural racism, you know, in my role as an educator. I don't have to take all that on, but within my classroom, within my role, how can I make sure I'm being as equitable as possible? That's really what we're talking about. Again, I start with the assumption that we all have good intentions. We want the best for each student. Benefit of the doubt, I'm just presuming that we all want that. I'm pretty sure, you know, I don't think any of you went into education thinking, you know, this is my path to wealth and prosperity. I'm going to become a teacher. I think most of us go into education because we care about the future of youth. I really believe that. You know, a lot of my hope around equity is embedded in that. So I'm starting with the assumption that we all have good intentions. But my final assumption is good intentions are not enough. Good intentions informing good actions. That's what we're looking for. Good intentions, deep understanding informing good actions. And again, I believe we all want, these are the good intentions. We all want to perpetuate good actions. I believe that. I have to believe that. That's my hope. I believe at the heart of things, that's true. But we have to work on it. We can't just sort of vaguely believe in it. We have to be willing to work on it. And that's what we're going to be doing today. A couple other quick introductory things. Just some quick objectives. I'm going to talk about just sort of a framework for understanding equity in schools. I call it a transformative framework because it's not just about nibbling around the edges. It's not just about adding a reading by an author of color, or, you know, it's really a deeper transformative way of thinking about equity. And then we're going to practice some equity literacy tools. The framework that I use is called equity literacy. How do we strengthen our literacy around equity? Yeah, that deep understanding, that's what we're going to work on. So here's where we're going to start with that. Quick sip of water out of my Shrek glass. We're going to start just by understanding the notion of equity. Just by understanding what the heck it is. Again, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about it. Now, I'm going to offer you a way of thinking about equity. I'm not going to argue that it's the only way or even the only right way to look at it, but it's just a way that I have found has been helpful to educators I've worked with in the past in terms of thinking about, okay, what does this look like, you know, in practice. But I want to start by asking you, I have two questions here. Let's just, for the sake of time, focus on the second one, which is, what is equity? What does equity mean? What is your understanding of what equity is? Because again, I can't cultivate something if I don't know what it is, right? So let's just start here. This might seem like kind of a simplistic way to start, but I just want to get, you know, I just want to get a sense of the range of understandings. So you just toss something in the chat box Equity doesn't mean equal. Okay, I think that's a good starting point. Fairness, great word there. Evening out the playing field. Everyone gets what they need. Access. Okay, great stuff coming up here. I love that sort of distinction between equality and equity, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. Opportunity, getting needs met. Michael, that's a great way of thinking about it. Equality of opportunity. Fair access to resources. So this is great. The stuff y'all are posting in the chat box, I think if we took all of those, sort of compiled them into a central definition of equity, I think we'd be at a pretty good starting point for, for equity. Now, I want to talk through equity based on what I call them the sort of the three components of equity. If I want a robust understanding of what the heck equity is, these are the sorts of things that will, that can inform that kind of robust understanding. The first one, and many of you are talking, and I'll talk about each of these individually, but many of you are kind of alluding to this in the chat box, but distinguishing between equity and equality. Right, that's important. I'll talk more about that in a second. The second component of equity, which I would actually argue is really the heart of equity, is about identifying and eliminating inequity. Let's identify all the ways bias and inequity are operating around us, because none of us want those things to be operating around us, right? That's that starting assumption. But identifying all the ways those things are operating, even in the smallest, most unintentional ways. We'll talk about some examples of that. Identifying and eliminating those. That's really what equity is. And so again, that takes sort of the humility of saying, I'm willing to look more closely. I'm not intending to allow any of these things to fester. But, how might I be doing that? What are the ways that I might not even notice them operating? We'll talk more about that in a second. And then the third component is fairly distributing access and opportunity. Fairly distributing access and opportunity. We want access and opportunity to be distributed to everyone fairly. And again, we don't want things like socioeconomic status or race or gender identity or any of these things deciding to any extent what level of opportunity somebody has. But I bet everyone in this session, if you were really reflective about it, could name several ways that does occur around us in schools. Okay. So we're going to practice some of that. So let's start with the first one, distinguishing equity and equality. Okay, now the big difference between equity and equality is that equity acknowledges the existence of the unlevel playing field, both in and out of school. So equality doesn't start with that presumption of an unlevel playing field. And because of that, equality really reproduces existing inequity. And let me give you an example of this. I was working with I was doing some work with the school, and one day a student approached me. I had just visited his classroom, and a student approached me and said, I'm in a predicament and I really want to, maybe you can help me think through it. So I said, sure. And he said, well, so he came out to me as a gay man. He said, I'm not out at school and I'm not out at home, but a lot of the students here just presume I'm gay, so I get bullied for it, even though I've never come out here officially. So he tells me this story, and he says, the predicament I'm in is that I'm accruing all of these tardies to class And the rule states that the next tardy I get is going to result in a call home, and then a few more tardies after that. And, you know, the disciplinary action is ramped up and ramped up and ramped up. And he said, what's happening for me is that, I'm often ruthlessly bullied in the classroom. And what's actually was happening to him was between fourth and fifth period, he had to pass through this kind of unsupervised stretch of hallway. And there were 4 or 5, this is in a high school, there were 4 or 5 men who are coming the other way and pass him every time, who are basically assaulting him, pushing him, knocking books out of his hands, calling him homophobic names and that sort of thing. And he said, there's this little sort of nook in the hallway where I can kind of hide until they pass by. But if I do that, I always end up being about 10 or 15 seconds late to class. And so what's happened is he's sort of accrued these tardies. So I said, well, have you mentioned what's happening to your teacher? And he said, your fifth period teacher. And he said, well, I was planning on doing that, but one day she sort of mocked me in front of class for being late. I said, well, everyone else can get here on time. Why can't you get here on time? And so that teacher, I'm sure, just being frustrated that somebody was coming to class late without any real intentionality of doing deeper damage than that, had sort of cut off that line of communication, that the student was not going to trust that teacher. So the student is accruing these tardies. The student is not messing around in the hallway. The student is not hanging out in the bathroom. The student is not hiding somewhere smoking. The student is not misbehaving. The student is trying to dodge homophobia, and really it's the school's responsibility. Really, the student is being punished for the school's failure to address homophobia in the hallways is what's actually happening. But that student is still, because the policy is this many tardies to class is this repercussion, he's being punished the same way students who are doing all of those things are being punished for being late to class. That's equality. There's a tardy, here's the punishment. That's equality. But that's also inequity, because this student has a set of circumstances as other students don't have, and that set of circumstances is not being addressed. And so that's the difference between looking at something through an equality lens and an equity lens. That student is experiencing equality, but also experiencing inequity. So here's what I want you all to think about, just as a little challenge here. And I want to use the example of students experiencing poverty, because I think that's the easiest place to find examples. I'm not going to necessarily ask you to respond to this, just reflect on it. I want you to think about a policy or a practice that you've seen in a classroom, school, or district that's applied equally. So everyone is held equally accountable to the policy, or the practice is applied equally to all students, but it could still have a disproportionately negative impact on, again, let's just say students experiencing poverty. So I think that's the easiest one to come up with examples for. Again, the point is not the intent of it, but the impact of it. So can you think of examples like that? This is the work of equity. None of us want this to happen. None of us want students who are already disadvantaged, by, societal bias and inequity that exists around socioeconomic status, to come to school and also have that experience at school. None of us want that. So then the question is, do I have the humility and do I have the will to look at the ways that that might be happening, even if I don't want it to happen? Even if I don't want it to happen. Yeah, that's a great example. Fees for yearbooks, activities, field trips. An example I often use actually is yearbooks. I often tell this story. I was working with this high school, or this actually a school district in Wisconsin, but this particular day I was working with the high school. I was walking in the front door of the high school and there was a yard sign outside the high school and it said, remember to bring your yearbook money by Friday. The early bird rate ends on Friday. And, again, this is my own example of how we, even those of us whose whole lives are committed to this, we have to keep working on sort of recognizing the way it operates. Because I've probably seen 100 examples of that sort of, early bird rate, and it had never occurred to me, but I'm walking into the school and it occurred to me and I thought, oh my goodness, nobody is using this early bird rate because they're trying to stick it to people experiencing poverty, but the early bird rate guarantees that the families with the most money on average are going to spend the least amount of money on the yearbook. And the families with the least amount of money on average are going to pay the highest price for the yearbook. That is an exact inequity. None of us are intending that. That's not why we do it, but it's still having that impact. Right. So it's really just about, can I recognize maybe how there might be things I'm doing in my classroom that I'm not intending to do that might have that kind of impact. There are other things happening at the school, but that's the difference. The early bird rate is equal in the sense that anyone who can pay early gets the discounted rate, but it's inequitable because it creates advantage for the people who already have the most advantage and disadvantage for the people who have the most disadvantage. That's the distinction between equality and equity. So a lot of other good examples in the chat box. Thank you all for sharing those. Okay, so again, that's the sort of the first component of equity, is distinguishing between equity and equality and really embracing equity. We don't have to wag our fingers at anybody. We don't have to shame and blame. We just need an awareness. We just need to commit to learning how to recognize how this stuff is operating, stuff that we don't even want to be operating. The second component is identifying and eliminating inequity. So a lot of times when I ask people what's equity, the response has something to do with giving each student what they need, in order to succeed. That is one sort of level of equity, and it's a really important level of equity. But it doesn't capture the whole thing. We want to think about inequities in policy. We want to think about inequities in practices. We want to think about inequities or biases in institutional culture. Those things don't change just based on our individual relationships with individual students. So we both want that with individual students, but we also want to say, okay, what are the biases and the inequities that are operating here? Because again, none of us want them to be operating here, right? Hopefully none of us, most of us don't want them to be operating, right? So, and what are we doing about those? What are we doing about those early bird rates? What are we doing about the, another example I often use are fundraisers, where students are put into competition to whoever can sell the most things. Well, that creates distinct disadvantage for the lowest income students whose families can't afford to buy a box of bad chocolate or ugly candles or whatever it is that we happen to be selling, So it's really about having the humility and the will and the knowledge, I guess, to be able to map out all the ways that inequity is operating around us, all the ways racial inequity and socioeconomic inequity and gender inequity and disability, all of these things, just to map out all the ways it's operating around us. To some extent, we're all participating in it. So I don't necessarily believe in the wagging our fingers and all of that. I mean, there's a time certainly to hold individual people accountable, but I mean, as a community, What we need to have the willingness to do is to come together and say, okay, well, let's just look more closely at this. Let's look at homework policies. Let's look at the literature that we're choosing. Let's look at the things that we do just as a matter of course and don't think about that much anymore. When I do, you know, I often have done these like focus groups with families experiencing poverty, and ask them, okay, well, what's an example of sort of an everyday thing at school that you find humiliating for you and your family? This is talking to parents. And it's interesting the kinds of things they talk about. One example is like the Scholastic Book Fair, which was really kind of surprising to me. You know, they're like, well, every year our kid gets marched through this thing and we can't afford to buy any books. And my kid has to watch their classmates buy books, and it's sort of humiliating. And none of us want it to be humiliating. So do we have the humility just to look at that and say, hey, you know, how can we do this differently? You know, if that's happening at your school, you know, we don't have to blame whoever set it up the way it's been done. Let's just think about how can we do this more equitably. The third component of equity is this sort of active, fair distribution of access and opportunity. And really what we're talking about here is, if we look at number 2, this is really in a way the backward facing thing. It's like, let's look at all of the policies and practices and curriculum and pedagogy and all that we've been doing up until now, and just have a critical look at it. How might it be creating inequities? You know, that you know, we as individuals might not be intending for it to create. Let's look at that and see how that might be happening. And let's fix that, everything we're doing up till now. Number 3 is really more the forward-facing thing, which is from here forward, do I have the knowledge and the skills and the will to apply this kind of equity lens to everything we do? I think one of the things people find overwhelming about this conversation about equity is that it often feels like it's this other thing that is just like slapped onto our pile of things we have to do. It's like, I'm already doing all this other stuff with the curriculum and the instruction and trying to follow this guide and trying to do, you know, PBIS and SEL. And now I also have to do equity. Well, I think it's helpful not to think about it that way. I think maybe it's helpful to think about it not in terms of the thing, like doing new things, but the lens through which we filter the things we do. It's a lens or a commitment. It's a lens or a commitment rather than a new list of things to do. How can we do the things we're doing equitably? That's the question. You know, how can we reimagine our curriculum with a lens, with an equity lens? It doesn't mean we have to throw the whole thing out. It just means that, you know, how can we take a different look at this? You know, okay. So those are what we call sort of the 3 components of equity. Yeah. And you know, to be honest, I just think this is a professional responsibility of educators, you know, is to minimize the extent to which we're creating this kind of damage and maximize the extent to which we're guaranteeing equitable access and opportunity.
Paul, I want to jump in real quick before you transition down. We're going to have a time for questions at the end, but there was a question that could help to kind of be addressed. The question that was posed was, what happens when everyone needs access and there's not enough of us to go around? So I thought you might want to address that one or ask some further questions.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I wasn't sure, Peter, maybe if you want to add a little more to the chat, it can be something that we jump in at the end to give us a little more context to what you mean when there with your question, or I can certainly follow up with you afterwards as well. But I was trying to type a response in the chat as well, but I wasn't quite sure exactly what you meant. So
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the roots of a really compelling question. So
I know,
I hope,
exactly. So,
I
yeah.
hope you
All
do.
right. All right.
So, okay, so let's just sort of go forward here, just talking about. So again, what I'm hoping to do by the end of this is just give you a sort of conception of equity that you can take into these other sessions where you'll be talking more about classroom stuff, practice, teaching, and role-specific sorts of things. So what is inequity? I think of inequity as this unfair distribution of access and opportunity. And that unfair distribution results in both outcome and experience disparities that are usually pretty predictable by things like race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, home language, other dimensions of identity. So there are two components of this that I want to look at. One is distinguishing between material access and non-material access. Material access is the easy piece to this. So I might ask you, what are examples of things that cost money, whether they're material things or services? What are examples of things that cost money that some students have access to and others don't? But the students who do have access to those things will probably be at an advantage in school. It's got nothing to do with how hard they work. It's got nothing to do with how much their families care about education. It only has to do with what they have access to. Tutors, mental health services, great example, private sports, internet, notebooks, food, medical care. Okay, great example. Now, again, we don't necessarily have control over families' material access, although we can be responsive to what we know to be disparities in material access. In other words, I can decide I'm never going to assign a project that requires, where students are going to be at an advantage simply because they have resources that other students don't have. I'm not going to perpetuate that. Like I can decide that, but I have no control over whether an individual student at home, has access to whatever compared to some other student. Okay, that's material access, kind of easy for us to wrap our arms around that and see the connections to outcomes. But I think an important piece of this is actually recognizing that a lot of the disparities are about this material access, and that the material access is not an indication of how much a student cares about school, whether they're invested in school, whether their parents care. It only has to do with access and opportunity. It has to do with socioeconomic disparities and that sort of thing. The second kind of access might be a little bit more hard, a little harder to wrap our arms around. That's what we call non-material access. This has more to do with institutional culture and practice. Right? Who has access to a curriculum that reflects people like them consistently, honestly, and holistically, rather than maybe occasionally, tokenistically, who has access to a curriculum that they can really sort of latch into, who has access to a school culture that's based around their cultural norms instead of someone else's cultural norms, who has access to, to teachers who have a deep understanding of their, experiences out in the world and that sort of thing. That's that sort of non-material access that we also have to kind of look at. And because that is admittedly maybe somewhat vague, I think that's the part that often gets missed. And so what ends up happening often is for lots of groups of students, including many students of color, students experiencing poverty, LGBTQ students, is that they're constantly spending their energy trying to fit into a culture where they just don't feel that connected, And then if they don't feel connected, often it's easy to look at them and interpret, well, they don't want to feel connected. Yeah. And again, I don't think there are many educators in the world who want to be creating that dynamic, but we know that dynamic exists. We know it exists, because it's very clear in research and the assessments we've done and everything else. So again, the question is, do I have the humility and the will to say, okay, I don't want to replicate that. So let me just reflect about it. Let me just look at my practice in a different way and see if there's something I can do differently. The other distinction I want to make is between outcome disparities and experience disparities. I think just in this kind of era of education, people tend to be very fixated on outcome disparities because that's how we're all judged, right? Test scores and quantitative measures. And those are really important measures, but we also want to look at experience disparities. Access to feelings of belonging. Who feels like they belong? Who feels like the school was created, for, in their image rather than someone else's image, that sort of thing. And I think this can be tricky because I think sometimes we can assume that if a student is doing really well academically, that might mean, that must mean that their experiences are also positive, but you can have, a gay student, for instance, who's getting straight A's, but is also experiencing homophobia, So we got to look at the experiences and also the outcomes. I actually think most of us are probably naturally more prone to look at experiences than outcomes, and maybe we sort of feel nudged into focusing more on things like test scores, because again, that's how we're being assessed, So then if we think about, okay, well, what is equity? What is equity? So I think of equity as a commitment to action. So that's the process of redistributing access and opportunity to be fair and just. And so what am I actually doing? What am I actually doing to make sure that access and opportunity are fairly distributed? What am I doing is the process of that. That process begins with being honest about the ways access and opportunity currently are not distributed fairly. Again, I don't think those things exist because everybody's out to get anybody, but those things exist in every school. They exist in every school. So we just have to look at, we just have to be willing to look at it, The second way of defining equity is as a way of being. So the state of being free of bias. Now, I think in a society where there's a lot of bias, it's hard to expect an institution within that society to be completely free of bias. So we think about this as kind of the aspirational way of thinking about equity. That's what we're moving toward. We're moving toward a curriculum that's free of bias. We're moving toward individual ideologies that are free of bias. It takes sort of constant work and reflection and humility, to get there. And none of us is ever going to be perfect because we're, imperfect humans. But that's what we're aspiring to. And again, I would just, in terms of my own sense of hope, I believe that that's what most of us want to be. I believe most of us don't want to be perpetuating bias and inequity, right? And that's a great place to start because I have a lot of friends who do this work in other contexts, maybe the corporate world or, wherever else where they can't necessarily to the same extent come into the conversation with that assumption, and I feel like, usually I can come into it with that assumption. So it's not, again, I don't think it's, the process is not, let's point out who all the monsters are and fix them. The process is, although again, I do think it's important to confront individual people who might be doing more damage. But the process is, can we come together as a community of educators and say, how do we put all of our skills and abilities together and create the most equitable environment that we're capable of creating. Here's something I'm really good at, so I'm going to contribute that. And someone else is really good at something else, so they can help me with that. It's about the humility to do that. And again, I believe we all want to get there. So the question is, do we have the humility and I guess the knowledge to get there? And hopefully today will help with that, with these upcoming sessions. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I want to wrap up in about 4 minutes. So there's some time for some discussion, and just want to talk about just a few places to start. And again, the purpose of my session was not to give you a bunch of practical classroom strategies. Some of the sessions in the next round, where you get to choose your session, are much more sort of oriented to that. The purpose of my session was just, can we go into those sessions with kind of a shared understanding of what equity is? Shared, robust, transformative vision for what equity is. So a few places to start. One is driving out deficit ideology. Deficit ideology is the belief system that outcome disparities are caused by deficiencies within individuals and communities that are experiencing the disparity. So in other words, if we see that there's an outcome disparity between, let's say, our lowest income students and our middle class students, someone who has a deficit ideology is going to tend to think, okay, well, what do we need to adjust about our lowest income students so they can do better? The other sort of end of the ideological continuum is called an equity ideology, or some people call it a structural ideology. People with a structural ideology will look at that disparity and say, okay, well, what are the barriers and challenges here? They're not going to immediately presume there's something we have to fix about people experiencing poverty. They're generally going to assume maybe we need to adjust. Maybe there's something we need to adjust about what we're doing, right? And what all the research says about this is the biggest opponent of equity ideologically is deficit ideology. Equity can't live where deficit ideology lives, because deficit ideology distracts us from identifying, deficit ideology distracts us from being able to identify bias and inequity and how that's operating. So that's the first thing. If I catch myself thinking, well, these kids or those parents, or, that's something I got to be reflective about. Okay. Second thing we could do is review policies, our own classroom policies, school level policies, even school or district level student conduct handbooks. Usually there's a lot of inequitable policies. There's bias. Sometimes there's shaming and finger wagging. I actually have looked at your policy documents, did not see a lot of the necessarily shaming and finger wagging as much as I see other places. But it's good practice, or just look at your own classroom policy and say, is there anything in here that might create extra disadvantage for certain students? Look at it openly. Again, give yourself the benefit of the doubt. None of us, hopefully, are doing that on purpose, if any of that exists, but it's tough to find a classroom where that doesn't exist to some extent, sometimes, occasionally, right? So we just want to minimize that, right? We just want to minimize it. Another thing we could do is ask the most marginalized member of the community and then believe what they say. Ooh, I'm missing a Y there, and they should be what they say. Okay. Now, a lot of districts hire us to do these big equity assessments, And you know, usually if you just do some focus groups and have some individual conversations, students will tell you, here are the ways that I'm feeling invisible here. Here are the ways I'm feeling marginalized here. Here are the ways that I'm feeling, you know, I'm experiencing hurt here. Yeah, and some of that's going to be around equity related stuff. Some of it's not going to be around equity related stuff. And it's all important, regardless of who the student is. It's all important. Here we're focusing on the equity related stuff. But of course, don't ask if you're not willing to change based on their feedback. What we hear a lot from students is that they're asked and then, you know, nothing changes. So we got to be willing to change. Just a couple more of these and we're going to wrap up. Focus on inclusivity rather than token representation. So if you're thinking about what this looks like in a curriculum or that sort of thing, we want substantive change in curricula and examples we use and that sort of thing. So students see themselves reflected. Now, again, we can't, I think sometimes people get overwhelmed and they think that everything I teach, I have to teach. You're telling me I have to teach it from every possible perspective. Well, that's impossible. You know, that's just not possible. There's not enough time to do that. The question is, over the course of the unit or over the course of the school year, are we inclusive? Not tokenistically, not the occasional, but are we really inclusive? That's the challenge. Right. And that's that sort of nudge away from just kind of nibbling around the edges to something a little bit more transformative. Finally, cultivate a culture in which feedback is a gift. I think because the equity stuff and racism, you know, words like racism and that sort of stuff, you know, gets a lot of people immediately on the defensive. It's like, as a society, we practically rendered ourselves incapable of having a robust conversation that's not immediately met with defensiveness and all that sort of thing. And we need to cultivate a culture, and this is where leaders, whether you're a positional leader or not a positional leader, you know, can step in, is creating a culture where it's just normalized to talk about this kind of thing. And it's normalized to get feedback, even if it's hard feedback. You know, that's seen as a gift rather than an affront, you know. And that's a big sort of societal culture thing, I think, that we have to grapple with. But we want these conversations to be normalized and we want to be able to get feedback. You know, why wouldn't I want to know if something I'm doing might be harming a student? I don't want to be harming a student. So why wouldn't I want that feedback? Why wouldn't I see that feedback as a gift? Well, I might not see it as a gift if I'm sort of sitting in a culture where everything feels very vulnerable, you know, where a culture where it's punished when people honestly name the existence of bias and inequity. You know, that doesn't, yeah. So, okay, I'm going to end there. It's 9:34 looks like, so we have about 11 minutes. And
okay, great, thanks, Paul. At this point, I do want to, there's a couple things that came up in the chat that I'll throw out there as questions. If people have questions for Paul, you can put them specifically in the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we will get to the questions that we can in our next, what do we got, about 10 minutes here. So let me start to just say that there was a little more clarification on a previous question. So I'll just kind of read the context. Let me get to the original question. We asked for some clarification, Paul. So the original question was, what happens when everyone needs access and there's not enough of us to go around? And then the clarification definitely gives us a little bit more context where here's the example. So many of our students need some help. The example that was given was at the high school, we have extended blocks of our English course. So that's kind of where he was thinking, was extended time for some kids that are behind in reading. So all need help with, and then all need help with their writing. So to make writing instruction equitable and give them access to all the resources, we have to spread ourselves too thin. There's only so much of the teacher to go around, and there are not enough teachers or reading specialists, etc., to meet the needs of the students. So we are already doing as much as we can. So it's quite a bind, was kind of the comment from there.
Yeah, well, that's why I said, earlier that, it shouldn't be the expectation that individual people are responding to this in a way that, trying to change things that are outside our sphere of influence to change. But I also think it's kind of, the easy response to that is to say, well, here is the way institutionally that we're sort of under-resourced. So, I think we need to be careful to say, okay, well, that lets us all individually off the hook. The question is, the things that I am doing, am I doing them as equitably as possible? And we can all stand to reflect, on that. We're all under-resourced, and that's a big institutional issue that certainly needs to be addressed. And that's why I don't sort of come in with guns a-blazing about how, because I know there's the equity ideal, and then there are all these realities that butt up against the equity ideal. Within that context, what literature am I choosing? How am I relating to different students? What examples am I choosing? Am I using, what kind of language am I using? Am I assuming gender binaries? Am I assuming heteronormativity? Am I assuming a standard of whiteness? These are all things that are about how we approach what we're doing, no matter how many resources we do or don't have, or how much time we do or don't have. So one exercise that I find useful that I used to do with my students is I would start by asking everyone to make a T-chart. And on one side of the T-chart, list, here are the things that I have control over. Here are the things I have control over. On the other side of the T-chart list, here are the things I don't have control over. Now, as a starting point, I need to just let go of the things I don't have control over. If I want to do some bigger level advocacy, I can go over after that stuff, and that's great. As in my position as an individual teacher, here are the things I have control over. How can I make sure I'm doing those things as equitably as possible? Then if I want a second step, I could take the things I don't have control over and make a new T-chart and say, out of the things I don't have control over, here are some things I have some influence over, even if I don't have control over them. I have some influence. Here are the things I have no influence over. And then I can do the same thing. If I want to take another sort of step, I can say, well, here are the things I have influence over. How can I apply the most equitable influence to those things? And I think that's sort of, to me, that's a bit of relief from the expectation that I'm going to be able to make these big institutional changes as an individual educator. The question is, in my sphere of influence, am I doing those things as equitably as possible? That's the question. And that's what I would challenge folks to reflect on. In the context of the imperfect circumstances, am I doing what I have the power to do as equitably as possible? And then I would say, part of that too is a call for accountability up the power chain. Why aren't I getting the resources I need? I mean, that goes into all kinds of things with school funding and all kinds of things that are up a bunch of power chains, and there are people working on those things as well.
Yeah, okay. Your answer honestly helped us answer another question that had a comment that had come in about just that overwhelming feeling as an educator about, like, as an individual, I don't feel I have that influence. It's those above me that have that influence. So I appreciate your example of the T-chart, because I really think that that helps those of us in whatever position we're in to really think about what are the things you could be doing, because all of us have that ability to impact our kids. And I think it's just like recognizing where your limitations are, but then also where you have some great opportunities. So I appreciate that example, because I think that helped with that question. The last question that we got here, and we do need to end right at 9:45. So we've got 5 minutes, so we should be good to go. Is just, what about the whole masking challenge? And I saw that, I can see the smile of like asking and forcing students to wear masks. Like, how do we handle that piece when it comes to an equity lens?
That's
Yeah, I know.
in a way, I feel like that's a better question for a healthcare professional than it is.
Yeah.
But everything is complicated. That's part of the challenge with this work, is nothing is simple. Everything is complicated. So there's part of the issue is, does everyone have access to masks? What does it mean for people who have different health conditions where wearing a mask might exacerbate it, and that sort of thing? So you might look at that and say that's an equality issue. That's an equality approach rather than an equity approach. But I would flip that also to say that I think there's another way to look at that in sort of the inverse way, which is, how do you protect people's well-being when there are some people who are just going to make a political decision or a values decision to wear or to not wear, and then there's going to be other people who are going to make the decision based on something else. I just think that's tough. I think that's one of those situations where there's no great solution to that.
Right. Yeah.
It's
okay.
Tough.
Yeah. We did get, right as I was saying, there weren't other questions. People are typing away. So we do have definitely some more questions. So just to let participants know, because we're likely going to come short here on time, what I've done is copy and pasted all of the questions for myself. So as we share follow-up information in regards to getting this session posted on our district YouTube channel and then our PD channel, and then also just follow-up information with our equity infographic, I'll make sure that I incorporate in questions. We have some great ones here, but we're not going to have time to dive into each of those. So I will make sure that we address your questions and that they're shared out either through our district newsletter or just an email from me. I'll have to kind of work with Heather Bennett on figure out how we want to make sure we get your questions answered. But again, Paul has referenced many times that we have sessions coming up that start at 10 o'clock here. There are 5 of them that are being facilitated by his team at the Equity Literacy Institute. I had the awesome opportunity of joining many of them in an equity series that was done throughout the summer. So I've seen them present. They're very engaging, and I hope that through those sessions, you'll find some information that you'll really be able to use, like Paul said, in your sphere of influence to really make a difference within your interactions with our kids. So Paul, I don't know if you have any parting words, but it's been great for sure. I look forward to working with you guys in the future.
Thanks. And these are amazing questions y'all are posting. So, maybe, I don't know, maybe you can send those to me and I can.
For sure. I will do that, definitely.
Well, enjoy the follow-up sessions, everyone. Thanks for the participation and the great questions. And thanks, Lisa.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks, Paul.